Mark, we moved to a new software a few months ago. I kind of like the countdown feature that our audience can't see. 5, 4. I kind of feel like Elon Musk and the rocket's about to go off. Maybe I shouldn't say that. Musk has become such a political hot potato these days. But I feel like, okay, this thing's about to take off.
That's right. That's why people can't. We're on YouTube, and so right before we start, there is a countdown. It goes 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and then the magic happens, right? And maybe not.
It's the Clifton and Rayner show. It's so good. It is so good. We are doing a podcast series, How to Know If Your Church Should Be Adopted by Another Church. This is being spoken from the perspective of the church that might be or would be or should be adopted. Oftentimes we talk about churches adopting churches. This is the adopted church. This is the church that is going to go into the family. And you need to go back and listen to episode 281 to hear Mark talk about the concept of adoption. We won't have to go through all of that in this episode. But we're talking about how do you know if your church should be adopted by another church? Part 2, we're going to talk about why this issue is becoming more common, why church closures are becoming more common. There's no simple answer. But Mark, one thing that we have to say at the onset is COVID did not help any. It may not be the reason, but at very least it was an exacerbator to what was already taking place.
Yeah. In COVID, remember in the earlier days, by the way, you and I were together when COVID started.
I've told that story so many times. We were in our church. We were in the church answers office recording. You got a call from the North American Mission Board said, go home and don't leave your house.
What? Go home? Yes, it's the pandemic there. They didn't call it a pandemic then. They just said we need you to get home. Everyone's. And I go, this is. I think I told Tom, I'll be back next week. Well, I wasn't back next week. Hey, no, seriously, the pandemic.
Wait, I got to say one other thing. One thing, Mark, before you do that.
Go.
The night before, you were at an NBA basketball game. Got called off in the auditorium or in the whatever it is. Their home field.
My adult son has loved the NBA his whole life, and so the closest team to us is is Oklahoma City. So we drove down to Oklahoma City because I hadn't been to an NBA game in years and years. I mean, since the Kansas City Kings were in town in the 1970s with Nate Archibald and Cotton Fitzsimmons as the coach. There you go. Throw those names out. Anyway, I decided to go ahead and buy tickets like on the third row. It was cool. So there we are. Trenton and I, my son and I, were on the third row of the Thunder, and I think they're playing the Spurs. Anyway, we're there on the third row. The place is packed. All right, it's a sellout. Okay. And so they have the pregame show and all that happens. And then the teams come out and they're doing their warm-ups and it's so exciting, and then they get ready to do a tip-off. And so the ref comes and he gets ready to put the ball up for a tip-off. And somebody runs from the bench and he grabs the ball out of the ref's hands. And then there's this announcement that says, please remain seated. There's no danger whatsoever. We just need to wait on the league to give us an official time of starting for the game. It's been delayed. Okay. Wow. So we wait and we wait and wait. And then they bring out the halftime show. So I'm figuring this is not a good sign that they're bringing out the halftime show. And then when the halftime show was over, they said, some of the players have tested positive for the new COVID-19 virus, and the NBA has decided to cancel the game. Please make your way quickly to the exit. And that was it. That was it. That was the last NBA game. I mean, I was at the buzzer for the beginning of COVID.
And the next day you were in my office having absorbed all of those germs and brought it. And we were recording right across from each other as you breathed upon me.
Yep, I flew from Kansas City to Nashville with Jill, and I went in your office, and then they shut it down. So now that everyone is really, really on their edge of their seat about two old men talking about what happened 3 years ago.
You remember back in the day?
When? Now let's talk about when you and I were younger, and we went through the actual influenza virus in 1916. Remember that one?
No, I have vague memories, but back to
the topic at hand. So back when we did COVID, remember there was, and it's true, those who had pre-existing conditions were at incredible risk for fatality.
Good analogy. Right? Good analogy, yes.
And so when you have churches that have pre-existing conditions, the COVID pandemic put them at incredible risk for them to die. And that's exactly what happened. They were already weak and they couldn't handle the stress and the strain of being shut down for that many months, and also having older people, which might have been the primary membership they had, absolutely not being able to get out and do things, and many of them becoming ill and that kind of thing. So they had pre-existing conditions that made them the most vulnerable and the most at risk for the pandemic.
Well, that goes back to our earlier podcast, previous week, episode 281, where we're saying if you are headed toward closure, do it sooner, or let's say adoption, do it sooner rather than later. You don't know what is going to happen. No one predicted COVID-19, and no one could have thought what it did to the churches, particularly the weaker churches. So this is another reason not to delay. Closures are becoming more common. Another thing that happens, Mark, the longer you wait, the longer some of the better members, I don't know if that's the best way to put it, but let's say some of the members who have a better outlook on life in the church, if they see something is happening and the majority is not going to do anything about it, they will leave. They will eventually go to another church. They just say it's not worth it anymore. So who is left? The more resistant members.
Yes, the ones that are less adaptable to change. Look, guys and folks who are listening to us who lead churches, you know what we're talking about. It begins to have this snowball effect that as the church becomes less and less resistant to change, those who are very much change agents and want to see things happen and want to take risk for the kingdom, and when they're not allowed to do that, they'll reach a frustration point where they say, look, obviously this is not the church for me. I need to go where my gifts can be used. And so what you have left is not a church that has a balance of people that are perhaps concerned about the taking care of the remaining members and also reaching new people, but you get a majority of those who are just concerned about taking care of the remaining members. And that's when that church turns in on itself. And among other things, you will never attract people who are mission-minded and missionary, because they'll pick up on that when they visit that church very, very quickly. And they'll go, this isn't for me. And so it really becomes a death spiral, Dr. Rayner, that church is in. And we see that. I think that's one of the reasons so many adoptions is the more resistant churches become. And it's in order to truly impact your community, you've got to be flexible and fluid anymore, not in your theology and not in your doctrine. You're not flexible and fluid in those, but you've got to be flexible and fluid with your schedule, with the use of your building. Even with everything you do in the church, you have to say, man, it's all about how do we reach the people who are not here? How do we become generous to our community? How do we serve our community? And if you're not going to do that, you're not going to be around because basically that's what Jesus wants you to do, and he will remove your lampstand. So I think one of the reasons we see so many dying churches is just what you said. As churches quit doing what God's called them to do, those people who feel passionate about that are going to leave. So all you have left are those who are basically the ones afraid to take risk, who hold on to nostalgia, and who many times also, let's be honest about it, everything else in their life is kind of out of control. Maybe they can't control their health. They can't control their children and their grandchildren anymore. Maybe they're on a fixed income, so they can't even earn any more money. They can't control how much money, but they can still control, what kind of paper we use for the bulletin. They can still control, what time of worship. We can still control. We're going to have a business meeting every month and pass out the minutes. I mean, there are these little things they can still control. And unfortunately, they find a disproportionate amount of comfort in that little bit of control. And it doesn't please Christ, and it doesn't bring them any joy either.
Hey, Mark, this is self-promotion, so I apologize in advance, but I'm going to put in the show notes 2 of the books I've written about this: Autopsy of a Deceased Church, Churches That Are Dying, and then the inverse of that, which I think is your preferred book, Anatomy of a Revived Church. So
it deals with all those issues. Yeah, perfect. As everybody needs to read those.
Thank you. Many churches are not waking up to the changing culture, and one of the things that was exacerbated during and after COVID was what I would call the churches that we would call it cultural Christians would be the best way to put it. people who said, I'm going to go to church because it's the culturally right thing to do for my business, for my politics, or just for my social life. I'm going to do that. Cultural Christians, as a rule, are not coming back to church anymore. And many of them took COVID as an opportunity to drop out. And now that cultural Christianity, which is an oxymoron and not really Christianity in itself, it kind of padded the numbers, if you will, and made us feel a little more comfortable. Those people are not around anymore, are mostly not around.
Absolutely. That's so true. And also, most of the churches that are, not all, we've got some mega churches that are dying. We got some large churches that are dying. But the majority of churches are not mega and large. I mean, so let's be honest. In our Southern Baptist Convention, 67, I think, is the median size. So half of our churches are below 67 in attendance. So the majority of our churches are already under 150, under 200. That means they're not regional churches. They're basically neighborhood churches or small community churches. And there was a time not that long ago, a few decades ago, probably when that church was doing well, that if you lived in a neighborhood, you sent your kids to Sunday school. You may have gone to church. It was the cultural thing to do. The cultural wind was at our back. No more. And so, there's no more low-hanging fruit in your neighborhood, okay? And so if there are Christians who move into your neighborhood, they're probably going to drive 50 minutes, whatever, to a church that has all the stuff they're used to having. And the fact that they would drive 5 minutes to your church when you don't have all of those things they're used to having, it just doesn't happen like it used to. It used to, they would come to your church because you're in their neighborhood. That's not the case anymore. And so I don't think that neighborhood churches, smaller regional churches, have fully understood the incredible cultural shift, which means, you need to have some outside people to come in and help you and give you the resources, because you can't just put up a sign and have a revival and Vacation Bible School and people are looking for a church and they're going to come to your church. You still can reach people in your community. It just has to be through conversion and evangelism. And it takes a lot of energy, a lot of effort, a lot of focus, and probably some personnel resources you don't have. So you have to get those from some outside sources. That's why adoption is probably the best thing for you. So churches with those resources to reach the unconverted in your neighborhood can come along, adopt you, bring those resources, and the church that used to depend on culturally approving people that would like to come and be part of your church now can reach people who are perhaps even opposed to the gospel, opposed to the church, but need to know Jesus and can meet him and can be converted and can become part of your church. That's a long way of saying it, but that's...
Well, it's a good way of saying it. There is an opportunity that is there as well. And the opportunity is COVID has more people working from home at least some of the time. And people are really desiring to commute less and travel less to work. And that could have an impact upon neighborhood churches. And so if your church is on the precipice of death, being adopted means that there may be a new opportunity to reach people who would not have otherwise come to your church, because now they're looking for something in the neighborhood, something in the community where they don't have to travel as far. So this is even a more urgent reason to consider adoption and reach those people who are reachable now.
But you and I both know when we talk to neighborhood churches, they do not understand how much the neighborhood has changed in 20 years.
So
they don't understand just being here and being welcoming isn't enough anymore. You've got to be in those people's lives. It takes time. It takes money. It takes resources to be invested in their lives, be invested in the community. It's just not a matter of, hey, we're here, people should be coming. We have good stuff. We love people. We're a friendly church. They just don't respond to us. You need to go out and respond to them. And that has changed. And as I said, many times those churches don't have the personnel resources to do that, but the other churches can come alongside and help you do that. And that's true at Linwood, the little church where I'm at. When I went there, as I told you last time, there were 3 remaining members. Well, even though it's a town of 400 people, these 3 were pretty elderly. And I mean, we needed help. So we were adopted by a couple of other churches that brought in some people, some resources, even some money, helped us put on some events, helped us communicate stuff to the school and give stuff to the school, help us reach some needs in the community. And through that, we made some inroads that we couldn't have made otherwise.
And you are a volunteer and unpaid pastor, if I recall.
Yes, I'm a volunteer and unpaid pastor and worth every penny that they don't pay me, by the
Of
way.
that, I will not argue. Absolutely will not argue. Another reason closures are becoming more common and you need to consider adoption is evangelism is missing in most churches. Mark, I've shared this before, but I'm going to share it again. We did a research project at Church Answers, and I want to be clear on the validity of the research. It was not a massive scale type of research where we could say, okay, the margin of error is plus or minus 3%. This was more of a case study. We ended up studying, well, it started off at just a little over 100 churches. We're probably closer to 200 now. So not a massive study. So I want to make clear of that. If someone says, can you give me the data on that? Well, it's notes. we talked to churches and we took notes. That's what it is. So I want to make clear what this is. So close to 200 churches. I'm going to give percentages. You can figure out how many churches at once. Of these churches, nearly 200, only fewer than 5% did anything evangelistically in the previous year. This is just a general survey. This isn't declining churches. This is just random asking churches to let us know the information. Fewer than 5%. Now listen to this. Fewer than 1% had an ongoing evangelistic emphasis. Instead of just one and done, fewer than 1% had an ongoing. It's going to be hard to reach people if you're not trying to reach people. Isn't that profound?
I'm just trying to absorb that. But as I absorb that, I'm thinking in my mind of all the churches that I've worked with in recent months. None of them had an ongoing evangelistic event. None of them had. Look, you can find fault with any evangelistic tactic. And believe me, there are some people now on Twitter and Facebook who spend their whole life trying to find fault with everybody's evangelistic tactic.
We probably know the same people.
Probably do. But you know what? Before you start fault with somebody's evangelistic tactic, why don't you tell me what yours is? But,
yes.
Back in the day, and I how many times during the podcast do you and I say back in the day? But back
you say it more than I do, and you're younger than I am.
But I mean, in the 70s and 80s, when I was really forming my ministry as a kid, as a young preacher and all, it was always something. There was either
evangelism explosion, continuous witness training, four spiritual laws.
Yeah. I mean, the church was always doing something, right? I go to a lot of churches now that aren't doing anything. And I can remember going to, I know, back in the day, North Phoenix Baptist Church, when Richard was the pastor there, and Glenn Campbell was a member of that church, and they would have Evangelism Explosion, EE, and they would train people. And I think it was on Thursday nights or something. Hundreds of people would gather at North Phoenix and go and then depart and go out across the city and do EE. And I understand, if I'm not mistaken on this, there were times that Glenn Campbell did it. Glenn Campbell came to your door. You might listen to the EE.
He's out there singing like a rhinestone cowboy.
But my point is that, here's this church. And so it's like, we don't do that anymore. And people will sit there, EE was what, like I said, I'm not interested in what you think about those things. The point was the church had a focus on it. They were equipping people to do it, and they were going out and doing it. Listen to me. Bus ministry. I'm not suggesting you go buy a bunch of 1972 dangerous buses, paint them all kind of gaudy colors, go around town, give kids candy to get on your bus. Probably not a good thing to do.
You would get arrested. You would be in prison for some time if you did that now.
But the reason that worked so well in the late 1970s, early 1970s, was that every Saturday, a bunch of adults and teenagers would gather at a church someplace, pray, and then go out across the neighborhood and try to find kids. Every Sunday morning, they would go there and pick up those. People were doing something outside of the church. It isn't nearly
exactly
as the strategy is that you're doing it, and people today aren't doing anything.
That's okay. You have said it well. Hey, Mark, in May of 2023, we are introducing what we've been beta testing it for several months, the Hope Initiative. And I tell you, the initial indicators are so good. It's a 30-day emphasis that becomes a year-round emphasis. And it's about prayer, merging prayer and evangelism. I could say a lot more, but to be announced, to be set free pretty soon. I'm so
And look,
excited about that.
I realize this goes out to all kinds of folks in all kinds of kingdom denominations, and we're so grateful for that. But the North American Mission Board, who I work for, they do have a resource page of all kinds of evangelistic resources. And so if it's okay, we can link that in the show notes.
Yeah, we will link that. And,
Yeah.
the evangelism approach that I use with an app is the 3 circles approach.
That's right.
And so I got permission from the North American Mission Board to use that in this new approach that we have. So you're exactly right.
Yeah, there's all kinds of evangelistic, and that's 3 circles is really, really simple. Also, the Who's Your One, where that's a lot of folks say, just pick one person this year that doesn't know Christ, pray for them by name, and have ways to encounter them with the gospel. So all kinds of great things like that.
I love it. Well, we are talking about how to know if your church should be adopted by another church. Just as a reminder, if you didn't listen to episode 1 was the often tough and unspoken issues in a church adoption. Episode 2 is why potential church closures are becoming more common. Now we're going to finish this up in episode 3, first steps toward church adoption. Let's say you've listened to these podcasts or for some other reason, you feel like, okay, I'm ready to consider it. I'm ready to move forward. You don't have anybody better than Mark Clifton to help you to know what to do next. And get ready to come back, because when we come back, you will be in the year 2023. So between now and then, have a happy new year, and we'll see you in the next episode.